welcome into hour number 2 of One Bills Live on this snowy Thursday afternoon. Snowy, windy, all the things in March when all of us are just over winter at this point. Like, give me spring, give me the sun, give me the warm weather. I'm ready for it. But you know what? We're bringing you some things to pay attention to as we talk about free agency. So many things happening here as the Bills have officially announced that they are releasing punter Sam Martin. So we're starting to see some news surrounding the Buffalo Bills as they have less than a week to become cap compliant and do have to clear some space here. But to continue on with our conversation about free agency, the AFC East and the Bills, we're going to welcome Mike Giardi into the show, writer at Boston Sports Journal and host of the All 32 NFL podcast. Mike, thanks for being on with us today.
Maddie, Steve, good to see you. I'm wearing a short sleeve t-shirt because it's 55 degrees here. I'm not trying to rub it in, but it's like one of those things. Like the moment you taste a little bit of spring, you're like, shorts, t-shirts, that's right. Yeah, let's go.
That's right, 55 degrees, and you keep your kids and your pets inside because of the heat, right? I mean, it just feels so good.
Exactly, yeah. The AC is on now.
Hey, thanks for coming on with us. Appreciate it. Listen, let's start with the big stuff that's going on. Early on, Myles Garrett decides he wants to trade, makes it very public, and has doubled down on it. I mean, he's not looking for a new deal from Cleveland, all that. What are the how do you see this turning out, and what's the time frame?
Yeah, I mean, I think the player has the hammer here, even though, he's contractually obligated to Cleveland. Like, he's too much of an asset at this point for Cleveland to just sit on it. You're not good. You have an opportunity to kind of cash chips here as you can, as you really start to begin your rebuild, because let's face it, what they tried to do with Deshaun Watson has not worked at all. And he's never going to play quarterback for them again, but they're on the hook for so many millions of dollars with him. So to me, if you want to kickstart the rebuild, this is how you do it. And I think what they're trying to do right now, Steve, is like by saying we're not taking the calls, they're just trying to set, to me, they're setting a parameter. Like, you can't even get in the door unless you start talking about 2 first-round picks. Like, let's get to that point. But to me, I think that's something that will happen. I would assume before the draft. That would seem to make the most sense for them.
We saw Buffalo have a pretty successful season last year, a team where many people were counting them out of even winning the AFC East, and here they are contending for a chance to win an AFC championship and make it to the Super Bowl. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen for the Bills, but looking at what the team did last season, in your eyes, what has to happen in free agency for the Bills to take a step forward in 2025?
Well, Myles Garrett is what has to happen. I mean, or you want to happen. They need a closer. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. And when they made the signing of Von Miller, I know some people are like, oh, it's too much money for a player his age. But you saw for the first, whatever it was, 7-8 games before he blew out his knee, what he was capable of and what the vision was there and why they wanted to do what they did. And obviously the injury thing has sort of changed everything. He's not the same player. Still, I thought this year kind of came on, but not the same player. To me, Myles Garrett is the same sort of thing and swing that you have to take here. Granted, unlike Von Miller, it's not free agency. You got to make a trade here. But considering where the Bills pick, and considering how Brandon Beane talked, I'm never afraid. I'm not afraid on the golf course. I'm not going to be afraid to do something. I think it's something they absolutely have to consider, because is he the guy that can get you over the top? Well, based on his track record, I think he could be. So that's a call I got to make.
And that's philosophically, we're asking our listeners and all our viewers to chime in. What's it going to take to satisfy your inner GM for this offseason? And we're getting. Some people are saying, hey, the DK Metcalf thing, let's just go all in on offense, do what we can with the defensive side, and the Bills set a franchise record for points. They scored more points through the regular season and postseason than any team in the league. Their defense made its living not being very good, but churning out turnovers, and that was all it took to get to the championship game, and it looked like for a minute they were going to go the distance. So there's some sentiment by some Bills fans that are like, listen, let's get another difference maker on offense and do what we can with the other side of the ball, maybe in the draft, get some guys or whatever, and just put it all on Josh and those guys and do that. What are your thoughts about that? Particularly with they got a James Cook going on, they got, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting conversation. And I'll just say when it comes to DK Metcalf, and this is probably a deeper conversation in terms of who's an actual number one receiver, I don't think there are very many in the league. And I don't think he's one of them. I think Jamar Chase, I think Justin Jefferson, I think there's Tyreek Hill, at least a couple of years ago was like, I think there's probably 7 or 8 guys that sort of, that's what they are. Now, granted, DK Metcalf comes to Buffalo or New England or whatever, and he immediately becomes their best receiver, right? So on your team, he's the number one, but is he the kind of guy that's worth paying? Not only, I mean, we're hearing right now they want a first and a third. I have a feeling that could end up being a second and a fourth. But is that the kind of guy that you want to trade that kind of assets for and then turn around and give him, he's going to want $30 million a year. He's going to want an extension. It's probably going to, be difficult if he doesn't get an extension in terms of making the trade, because he could just say, look, I'm not going to sign with them. So you can trade me there and I'll go play for 1 year and 26 million or whatever it is. But like, they're not going to sign me again. I'm going to go to the market, and then no one's going to want to give up that sort of thing. So he would make a difference for the Bills, no doubt. But I don't know if that'd be high on my list. I'd kind of put that down the list, I think, Steve, in terms of what I'd want to do if I was Brandon Beane.
You mentioned Myles Garrett or a pass rusher. We're discussing DK Metcalf as well. Where do the Bills fall on your aggressive meter of how aggressive they need to be this offseason to get over that hump that's existed for this team now for several seasons?
Well, I mean, the wonderful thing about being the Buffalo Bills is, just the Josh Allen, the window is always open with Josh as your quarterback, right? But you want to make sure you did this thing and you sort of took the step back roster-wise and let Josh do more. And again, it went better, as you mentioned, Maddie, better than anyone, Steve, better than anyone thought it was going to. Maybe not in the building, but elsewhere, nationally when they were looking at that team. But then you did see some of the deficiencies coming up. And so I know they're still sort of straddling the money line a little bit, but like they can make stuff work if they want to make it work. And I think I would be taking that big swing. And again, I just keep going back to the idea of having a guy on defense on third down, 3rd and 8, who's going to go get Patrick Mahomes. Right now, you don't have that guy. Greg Rousseau's a nice player. He's not a closer. Myles Garrett becomes that guy. So if I'm Brandon, that's the way I'm thinking. I think he's shown you that he's willing to do that. He showed you he was willing to do it with Von Miller. Why not do it again here?
So now the Bills are sitting there. They've just had this juggernaut of an offensive season. Their quarterback's the MVP, all that. James Cook explodes, has all these touchdowns. Now he wants a new deal. And we were sitting here. I was sitting here in this chair saying, there's no way he's going to get $15 million a year because, the top guys, Derrick Henry's getting 8, Saquon's getting 12, and then all of a sudden Saquon's deal changes everything. Now, what's the market look like for running backs, and what's your philosophy on how much you pay the guy?
Yeah, I mean, I'd try to slot James in around $10 million at this point, and that's as we've kind of heard from his side, that's not what he wants to do. So then it becomes a situation where do you hold the franchise tag over his head at some point? Like, hey, we're going to go year to year with this thing. Like, we just can't do it again. Maybe we can talk. Maybe we can find a better number. But right now, we're not willing to put 15 on the table. I don't think you can do that just yet. For as good a player as he is, and trust me, I'm not trying to knock him. I love the player. I really do. I think he's dynamic. But show me it again. Repeat it. Be on the field a little bit more for us. And then maybe you can have that long-term conversation where, again, I don't think you're going to 15. But with the way the cap's going up, maybe you can say, okay, we could do, 2 and 25 or 3 and 38 and 2 of the first 2 years are guaranteed, something of that sort of equation and work it out that way. But I just can't see them at this point still with the sort of the financial stuff going on with the team that's something that they should do right now. Because I don't think they can get ahead of it. I think it's just going to have to be like, you want this, we're only willing to pay that, so let's just play it out and see what happens.
Let's look at the AFC East and the other teams within this division that are going to be making some moves soon to make their roster become more full, and the picture is going to be more clear here in a week or so. The Patriots, they have money to spend. Over $120 million in cap space is what they have right now. The Bills have to clear about $9 million in cap space. I know Sam Martin helps with that number. But what are the Patriots capable of doing this offseason to help bolster that roster with the new head coach in Mike Vrabel and a quarterback in Drake May who had some positives last season?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. What do you do when you have $127 million in cap space, but there aren't enough players in free agency we're spending that money on? And that's kind of what we've seen now, I think, for the last, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, with the way teams have gotten have improved with dealing with the cap. There's like one team every year, maybe two, that's sort of quote unquote in cap jail, but generally it's like, no, with you talk about the Bills, like with a simple restructure of Deion Dawkins and Josh Allen, they immediately are like 20 million under the cap. So like, and it's already sort of built into the contract. So like, that's how teams are working now, and sort of have this vision for years ahead of time so that they don't get caught in a situation where, oh my God, we have to cut all our players. We can't do anything. We're just going to stink. Like, in general, most teams have such a good grasp on this that now the best players don't get to free agency. I mean, you see Zach Bond, who he probably got more than I thought he was going to get from Philadelphia, but like, he was a guy, if he got to free agency, I don't know, there might be 3 or 4 teams bidding on him, and he had a chance to maybe get another year on the contract, or maybe a few more million guaranteed. And he's like, you know what? Good situation. They like me. We just won a Super Bowl. I'll stay. And I just feel like that happens over and over again. And you saw a wave of signings across the league over the last 10 to 12 days where it's sort of been that way, where it's like, we looked at this market and he's better than anybody we have, or he's close and we know who he is and we know how he fits with our team. So let's just pay him so he doesn't get there. So I think that's the kind of spot that the Patriots find themselves in now as well. Yeah, we have this money, but who are the high-end free agents? Milton Williams, Josh Sweat. Josh Sweat has the knee issue. Maybe that's not a place they're willing to go, but you sort of run out of names. And then on top of that, you're 4-13 last year. You were 4-13 the year before. I think even with the change in coach to Mike Vrabel, who obviously has a much stronger presence and respect league-wide than the staff had last year, led by Gerard Mayo in his first year, that you're still not there yet. I think a lot of guys will look at the roster and say, it's not a good roster. Like, do I want to go there? And like, maybe in year 2 we start to become a playoff team, but right now, how do you foresee making that big jump? So it's a great spot to have the money. I just don't know that there's enough players out there to spend the money on.
Yeah, and that's really going to be the key. It comes down to everything. I mean, it comes down to picking the right guys, and certainly there should be some elevated expectation for how this team looks over 2 back-to-back 4 and 12 years or 4 and 13 years. There should be some elevated expectations in New England, however, right?
Oh, yeah, no question. I mean, look, as I sit here and say this, I think there is a much more positive vibe about what's going on, and a belief that, hey, we have a coach that has had success before versus, again, the hodgepodge staff that they put together last year. The inexperienced guys didn't know each other. This is, hey, Mike knows Josh. Mike knows Terrell Williams, the defensive coordinator. Like, there are pieces together. A lot of former Titans guys are on the staff. They have far more cohesion to start this process than they did at any point last year. And I think you talk to people around the league, and they're watching because there's a lot of respect for Mike, and there's respect for Josh as an offensive coordinator, Josh McDaniels, obviously not so much as a head coach. And then the Drake May factor, right? Like, people saw enough from Drake May last year to feel like he's tracking in a franchise quarterback direction. So, okay, but now again, sort of show me that it is going in the right direction. Show me that there are more better players on that team, younger players that didn't really make a mark last year from the draft class that can impact the team. And then I think they become next year, if a 7 or 8 win season happens and Drake continues to track in the right direction, then they become a much more feasible option, I think, for the better players in the league. Because right now you hear like DK wants to go to a contending team. Devontae Adams wants to go to a contending team. Like, everybody wants to go to a contending team, and you're not that yet.
Aaron Rodgers also wants to go to a contending team. Speaking of his former team in the Jets have a new head coach in Aaron Glenn and a quarterback position questions surrounding that position as to who's going to play that position. Is it going to be Tyrod Taylor? Is it going to be somebody else? As you look at the Jets and what they have to do this offseason, what are some of their free agency needs?
I mean, certainly they got to answer the quarterback question, and it feels like if Justin Fields actually gets to free agency, and Pittsburgh has made some noise about wanting to keep him, then that's probably their best option. And that's not to say that he's still young enough where you can sort of project maybe some improvement here, and he's been a guy that at least his teammates really like and rally around. He hasn't developed quite as a passer like you would have expected, coming out as, I think, the 8th overall pick from Ohio State. But beyond that, if they whiff on Justin Fields or he doesn't get to the market, it's a pretty bleak situation out there. There's far more teams that are needing a quarterback than are actually out there. Obviously, Sam Darnold would be someone, had he not been in New York, maybe would be someone that they would consider, but I don't think Sam wants anything to do with going back to the Jets. He's lived that, done that. I don't think that would appease the fan base either. It would seem like that would be a terrible marriage. And then where do you start to go? Daniel Jones, who of course didn't get it done with the Giants. There isn't a lot out there. And then, where they're picking at 7, could they work their way up to the draft? And I don't know if they can get to 1 or would want to pay the price to get to 1 to get Cam Ward, who clearly has separated himself as the quarterback in that tier. Do they like Shedeur Sanders, or do they like someone like Jackson Dart? And is that someone that you trade up for, or is that someone that you can go backwards and maybe get? I think that's something they're going to have to figure out, but it's not an enviable position to be in, trying to find that quarterback, or at least a stopgap situation in this current crop of players. But their defense is good, and it should be better. I think Aaron Glenn will have a clear vision, and I think that's an area where, especially in the draft, because it's so good in the defensive side of the ball, defensive line in particular, that they could sort of get back to where they were a couple seasons ago defensively, and then it's, okay, just give me competent quarterback play, and maybe they're back in the mix as being, not contending for the division crown, but maybe contending for a playoff spot.
Yeah, and you're right. The Jets have some question marks that you don't know if they're going to be able to answer them in this offseason. It may take 2. And certainly Aaron Glenn's going to have at least a 2-year leash to make some moves and to get the guy. And you go down further south into Miami, they paid Tua a few years ago. They're married to him. Mike McDaniel seems to be a guy who has that locker room, but it's a franchise. They look soft. They don't play with any grit. They got guys that because they got coached hard 2 years ago by Vic Fangio, they got him fired because they didn't want to practice hard, play hard, do all the things he asked, and he goes to Philly and they win a championship. It doesn't look good down there.
Tyreek is saying things
Tyreek
too.
wanted to get and I get it emotionally right after the season they got put out of. It's hard not to one out, but Miami is a different animal because it doesn't seem like players or talent was the issue.
Yeah, so it's funny because Mike McDaniel was sort of all the rage for about a year and a half, 2 years, right? And now, after the way last season ended, there were some questions about whether they're even going to bring him back. And he had just signed, I think, an extension right before the season started. But that was a real conversation down in Miami for a couple weeks. I'm glad you brought up the Tyreek Hill situation, because to me, I think if they're smart down there, they move on. And look, it was a right move to make at the time, and he really impacted them and had 2 terrific seasons. But last year there was some complaining during the season and some pouting during the season. Then they basically feel like he quit on them in the last game. So you can talk about the sort of, saying I want out after the season's over because of the emotion. Yeah, I get it. But there was emotion during the game where he basically shut it down, and he could have continued to play. So to me, that's it. I'm done. We're paying Jalen Waddle, and no, he's not as good as Tyreek Hill, but he's a lot younger. And Tyreek, with some of the muscle stuff, you start to wonder, can he be the 4-2 guy, consistently anymore? And so to me, I'm just saying, if I get a second round pick for him, because again, someone's going to get left out in the we need a wide receiver 1. That's what I'm doing. I'm moving on from him because I think he's now become part of the problem, and start to remake that team a little bit in. As you said, a little bit of a tougher image they need, I think, to build that team up again, because you are going to have to go into Buffalo at some point. You are going to have to go if New York gets it going in the right direction. If, Patriots, Drake May and Mike Vrabel, you're going to have to go win some games up north, and they just can't seem to do it, and haven't for a long time.
After DK Metcalf requested a trade and it was granted, Hill took to social media and said everyone's trying to get out. So always has something to say. It'll be interesting to see what happens there with Miami and Tyreek Hill. And you rarely see a team that's paying 2 wide receivers near $30 million a year. It's hard to make that happen when you're also paying a quarterback and some other players as well. But as we sit here and talk about the AFC East at large and needs this offseason for each team, where do things shake out for you right now as to rankings in the AFC East? In your mind, Does it look like Buffalo has a clear pathway to crowning themselves AFC East champions once again?
Yeah, it feels like they have a stranglehold on it because we saw last year again, sort of taking a step back in many cases in terms of moving on from key players and still putting up the season that they did. So to me, they are the unquestioned top dog in the AFC East until somebody proves otherwise. I think the Patriots do have a chance, depending on what happens here with free agency and what they do with the number 4 overall pick in the draft, of moving back into at least a position of respectability. And the Jets to me is one of those things where, again, like I said, if you can solidify the quarterback position, doesn't even have to be a star, but get competent quarterback play and get the defense back to where it was just 2 years ago, then I don't see why they can't be a team that actually contends for a playoff spot. And I'm currently out on Miami. I don't know if you can tell. I don't like the way that's trending, and I'm not sure that they're willing to do what it takes to sort of turn it over to the point where they can become that team that can come up north in November, December, and January and win a game that matters.
One last, before we go to break, Mike, let me just ask you that, the deadlines, we were talking about it, deadlines make a lot of action. Coming up on this deadline, is there any cap casualties you think that may be a surprise around the league? I don't know if you have a pulse on all 32. It's hard to keep track of, but we've already seen teams jettison veteran players, guys getting released. Anybody that you think is going to be a surprise or has been a surprise?
No, I think. This is to the point of, I think teams have done such a good job with this now that you don't get as many as we used to, or you're accustomed to, or you're kind of waiting for who's going to be that, or who's going to be the post June 1. A lot of these guys that we thought Joey Bosa was going to get cut. Joey Bosa got cut. We thought Javon Hargraves was going to get cut. He gets cut. So I think no one has really surprised me. The one name I would keep an eye on is in Cincinnati, and that's Trey Hendrickson.
Right.
Because they've made it clear, and Joe Burrow has pushed them. Jamar and T. Higgins are 1 and 2 on their list, and Trey is 3. And I know they've talked about keeping all 3. I think the idea of paying 31-year-old Trey Hendrickson $25 or $30 million a year, which is what he wants, even though he was awesome last year, doesn't make a lot of sense, especially if you're trying to placate Joe and make sure that Higgins and Chase stay long term. So to me, that might be a name that could come up in the next couple days, or you start hearing in trade conversations, because he does still have a year left on his contract. That could be one that pops up.
All right, one to
Thanks.
keep an eye on. Mike Giardi, thank you so
Appreciate
much for
Mike.
joining the show.